Earlier this year, I started my trip on the Natchez Trace Parkway in Natchez, Mississippi, and I hit every single roadside stop along the way, all the way up to this point here, which is just outside of the Tishomingo State Park, where the trace was closed. Now, later this year in October, I got back on the trace right here and continued my journey up towards Nashville, hitting every single stop, like before, all the way up. Now, if you're interested in what I saw on the south part of the trip, I'll leave some links in the description box below of those videos and best of. Now, this video is the best of the part 2 of Tishomingo up to Nashville, where I hit every single stop, and this is going to be the best of the best. Now, starting out my journey here, the first stop outside Tishomingo State Park is the Cave Spring. This stop has 2 caves in it that formed when a sinkhole formed many years ago. When the ground sunk, it revealed the 2 caves. There's one to the left and one to the right. Now, as you can see here, the one that's on the left is not very big, and it's more of an overhang than anything. Now, it could have been bigger back in the day, and the ground could have filled in with soil erosion, washing with dirt, things like that. Now, as you can see here, we go over to the right side. Now, this is a little bit more substantial cave. This is what you usually think of when you think of a cave. Now, it's not a big cave either, but for Mississippi, it's a pretty decent sized cave. Now, as you can see, there is a good bit of water in it. I can't really tell how far it goes, and I didn't want to journey into that water, but it was cold water, let's just say that. And I thought that was pretty interesting just to see a cave in Mississippi, because when you think of Mississippi, you think of nothing but trees and rednecks, and you really don't think of rocks and caves. So this is a pretty interesting stop. And just past those caves was the Bear Creek Mound. This was a structural Indian mound, which is a little bit different from a burial mound, as a burial mound is rounded and a structural mound has a flat top. And this is where they had their houses, their places of worship, where they just hung out. It was just interesting to see a Indian mound. Now, this wasn't as big as the Emerald Mound that I saw back in May, but still pretty impressive. So I made it out of Mississippi and into Alabama finally, and I'm here at the Freedom Hills Overlook area. Now, what this is a trail of about a quarter mile up through the woods and up a fairly substantial hill, but at the end, the reward is a very nice overlook. Now, this isn't my favorite overlook of all, but probably one of the better ones of the south end of the Natchez Trace Parkway. This is the Buzzard Roost Spring. It is a naturally forming spring that forms from the side of this hill. Now, this is also the start of the Buzzard Roost Creek. Now, it's not a very pretty creek with the moss and algae on the bottom of it, but it's still very clear water. And you don't see too many springs around my house, so this is kind of a neat little treat to see. This is Colbert's Ferry. This is where George Colbert supposedly charged Andrew Jackson about $75,000 to ferry his troops across the Tennessee River during the Civil War. Now, there's nothing too much spectacular out here, but it does give you a very good clear look of the Tennessee River here. This is the Rock Springs Nature Trail. Ever since I saw pictures and video of this scene right here, I knew I had to go see it. Now, this is the Rock Springs Creek that forms from a natural spring that we'll see here later. Now, this is an area where some beavers were trying to build a dam to dam up the Rock Spring Creek, but they are pretty unsuccessful right now. This is what I believe is called the Rock Spring. This is the spring that forms that little creek that the beavers are trying to dam up. Now, right after the beaver dam, that little creek forms into the Colbert Creek. Now, on the nature trail, once you pass by the spring, the nature trail loops back around, goes on top of a hill, and gives you views of the area you just came from, but just from a higher perspective. Then the trail loops back around, crosses back over those stepping stones, and back into the parking lot. Now, total, it's probably about a half-mile loop trail, not very long, but it was a very nice change of pace. It had some hills to climb, some pretty interesting views, and I really liked those nature stepping stones they made. Now, this stop is not necessarily on the trace, but it's right close to it. This is Wilson's headquarters and camp. This is the area where the largest cavalry was ever amassed in the Western Hemisphere. In this area during the Civil War, there was 22,000 troops stationed here before they went into Tuscaloosa and Birmingham, if I'm not mistaken. Now, this also is another area that has a spring coming out of the side of the hill. As you can see, I have a likeness for springs. It's just interesting to me seeing water come out of the side of a hill. Like I said, I live on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and springs are not something we get to see very often, if at all. Another thing that intrigued me about this area is the rock and stonework that's here. I'm not sure when it was done, but I'm thinking it was to prevent erosion from the spring as it come out of the side of the hill to stop it from eroding more and more. But it was very interesting rock work, and I wish it had been kept up instead of moss covered, and it didn't look too pleasing, let's just say. But still, it was quite interesting to see, and I'm glad I got to stop here and see it. Now this is a Sweetwater Branch hiking trail. Earlier on my trip, it took me a little bit to figure out, when they say branch, it's what we usually call a creek. But anyways, this hiking trail followed this branch through the woods and ended up at a Indian cave or overhang. It was an area that Indians had stayed at along their way or possibly lived at for a while. Now I thought that was kind of interesting. Along the way of the trail was these black, I think they were walnuts or black hickory nuts. I think they're walnuts. Well, the fact about those is the Indians used the husks to dye their hair and their clothes black. So that was kind of interesting to see along the way too, an Indian relic, let's just say. Here at the Glen Rock Branch picnic area, the main attraction isn't the restrooms. Although they were really nice and clean, I think the main attraction here is the rocks and the creek that flows through this nice picnic area. Now I wish I had spent more time here and actually had a picnic, because these are pretty interesting rock formations. They look like stacks of pancakes almost, and the creek flowing through the area. It was a nice cool afternoon, and I wish I would have stayed here longer, but I didn't have time to stay. I had to move on. Now this area here is not necessarily open, but it's not necessarily closed either. I believe this was the old Morgan Branch picnic area, and it's no longer in use. As you can see here, it's definitely not upkept. This is the second of 3 abandoned areas I found along the length of the Natchez Trace. Areas like this always intrigue me as to why did they shut it down, what did it look like back in the day. Now I think the main reasons why this one shut down, it was fairly close to the previous picnic spot that we just seen. And as you look here, as I go for the woods, there's not much room after you get off the parking lot to where the hill basically drops off pretty substantially into the creek that's down there through the woods. Now I didn't make it down to the creek because I didn't feel like falling down the hill, but tomorrow's another day, and if I ever get back up there, I'm going to spend a little bit more time here just doing a little more exploring. Some people don't realize that there is a difference between the Natchez Trace Parkway and the Natchez Trace Trail. The trail was the original means of transportation, whereas the Natchez Trace Parkway is the more modern day. Some parts of the parkway do follow the trail, but not all the time. This section of road right here is about a 2-mile section that follows the actual Natchez Trace Trail through the woods. Now along the way there's a couple of spots that's overlooks, but as you can see here, they're pretty overgrown. Now here's another area that has a nice restroom and some interesting rock formations. This is the Jack's Branch picnic area. Now it's not as big as the Morgan Branch picnic area, but it's still pretty interesting. Now one of the things I found that was interesting, and it kind of goes back to the abandoned rest area that we looked at previously, is you can see here on the ground, it looks like there was asphalt for possibly a walking trail or some sort of hiking path. I'm not sure. It's just interesting to me. Kind of intrigued me. Why is it there? Why don't they use it? And why don't they keep it up? Nevertheless, it was a pretty nice expansive picnic area that was kind of deceiving from the parking lot. It didn't look as big until you got down into it. Now, I didn't get to have a picnic here, but if I ever get back in the area, I'll probably have one here. Now, if you think I'm walking on a section of the sunken trace, you're quite mistaken. This is actually a man-made waterway that was used to cool off a metal furnace that was in the area. What they did is dug this trench out and fed water into it via this creek that's here. Now, this furnace closed shortly thereafter, after the Napier mine that was further down the road closed in the late 1800s, if I'm not mistaken. So this creek was flowing pretty good that day, and if it had been a hot summer day, I definitely would have minded dipping my toes off in it or possibly going for a little swim. But I didn't have time, and it wasn't very hot out that day. Now, at the end of my first day back, I ended up at the Meriwether Lewis Park. This is the site where Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark Explorations was found murdered. There is a recreation of the stand that he was found dead at, and also a nice campground with lots of hiking trails. Now, if you want to take a look at that, I actually have a full video on this whole experience here, and I hate to say it, but I lost some of the footage, so it's not going to be in this particular video. But it was a nice spot to camp and do some hiking, see some sights, that sort of thing. The next morning, the first thing I came to was the English camp picnic area. Now, there was only one or two little picnic tables, so it was a pretty small picnic area. But this cool little waterfall kind of made up for it. The only bad thing is this whole area was at the bottom of a pretty steep hill. Then a little ways down the road, there was an area at one point that was very rich in phosphate. Now, what did you do back in the 18 and 1900s whenever you found an area rich in phosphates? You mined it. Now, this is a phosphate mine trail. The trail is the old railroad bed of the railroad that they used when they pulled the phosphates out of those mines. Now, here at the end of the trail, there is actually a, not large, but it's larger than the other phosphate mines that you could see. And they don't want you going in there because it's unsafe. But if you're feeling pretty frisky, you could get down in there. But I wasn't feeling that frisky. This is the Fall Hollow area. Now, the sign is a bit deceiving as it really doesn't describe the area. Right off the parking lot down a little hiking trail is 3 beautiful waterfalls of different sizes and shapes, I guess you would say, that sort of thing. Now, when I was here in mid-March, it was the dry season, so the falls weren't, let's just say, as grand as what they could have been. So next time I go in the area, I'm going to try to get up here in the springtime when the spring melt comes through and there's more water in the area. I'm just going to let these clips run and let you see the beauty of these falls. This is a section of the old trace. Now, one thing I noticed, the further north I got on the Natchez Trace Parkway, the less areas there is to get off and look at the old trace trail. Now, the one thing I'm thinking of why is because the further north you got, the less sunken the trace is, and it was just basically a flat trail and not very appealing to some people, I guess you'd say. Now, this is one of the first sections, I believe, once you come out of Nashville, where you actually start to see how sunken it will get. Now, this is also very close to the parking lot. As you can see, my car is right there, less than 10 feet away. So if you have limited mobility, this would be a good spot to get off the trace and go see a section of the Natchez Trace Trail. Here is an old tobacco barn that you could actually go inside, and there was tobacco drying out inside of it, and that was pretty cool. Now, the road that I'm on is part of the original Natchez Trace Trail. It's another one of those sections of about 1.5 miles to 2 miles of the original Trace Trail. Now, it's a one-way road, so you don't have to worry about oncoming traffic. Now, one thing I did notice about this section, it's mostly gravel and fairly bumpy. So if you're in a small car like I was, you might want to take your time with it and don't get in a rush. But it's still pretty neat to see an old section of the trace that was, you could be able to drive on it, and you knew good and well that this was the original section of the Natchez Trace Trail. This is the Jackson Falls area. It was a pretty popular area for picnickers, as the parking lot was very full. Now, after about a 1/4 mile trek down the trail, it led you to the Jackson Falls area. Now, this whole fall area is at the base of almost like a canyon or a ravine, if you will. As you can see there, it's about, if I was guessing, I'd say about 50 to 75 foot below the edge there. Now, like I said previously, there at Hollow Falls, I was there in the dry season after a pretty substantial drought we were going on. So the falls weren't as majestic as what they could have been. So, like I said before, if I come back in this area, I'm going to try to hit the areas that have the waterfalls in it more in the springtime, because I would like to see them in their more grand stature, because they're still nice this way, but they're pretty depressing not seeing them, knowing what their full capacity could be. But it was still definitely worth the stop, and I'm glad I did it. Now, this is what I believe they call a federal style home. This was the home of John Gordon and his wife, and is one of 2 original structures still left on the Natchez Trace Parkway. The other is Mount Locust that we saw in my previous videos of the first half of my trip on the trace. And it actually has a ranger stand at it actually as well. Now, John lived about a year or so after he had his house built, and his wife continued the farm even after he passed away for years and years. And before he died, he actually had a ferry that crossed the Duck River nearby. But unfortunately, we couldn't get to the Duck River ferry crossing, as part of the original pathway down to it had washed away. But it's still pretty interesting to see the house. Now, the exterior has been renovated, but the interior has not. And I'm not sure if they're trying to renovate it or going to renovate it, but I hope they do in the near future. Now, getting close to the end of the Natchez Trace Parkway towards Nashville is the Birdsong Hollow Bridge. This bridge was constructed in 1994 and was the first concrete double arch segmentally constructed bridge in the United States. Each one of those arches was built out of sections. Think of it building with Legos. Each little section of the arch was built in sections. Now, the bridge stands about 145 to 150 feet to the highway below. And in the mid to late 90s, it won quite a few awards for its design and architecture. Now, this is the last stop on the Natchez Trace Parkway. It's a small little roadside picnic area. It's about 4 miles from the northern terminus right outside of Nashville, Tennessee. It was at this point here that I realized that my trip's about to end, and how much of a good time I had doing it. When I do this trip again, Oh, most definitely. In fact, I might even do it in the next, let's just say 5 years. But this time, I'm going to start from the northern terminus, which we already had now. I had a really good time on this trip. I learned a lot. I experienced a lot of interesting things. I learned a lot of stuff that I never knew or even knew existed. Now, I did have some ups and downs, such as the bad weather, and I had an incident with a tire, let's just say here. But overall, I really enjoyed my time out in the Natchez Trace Parkway, and I appreciate everybody sticking with me and joining me on my trip and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, I had a really good time on this trip. So now I got to think of what's my next trip going to be. What road am I going to follow next? But anyways, appreciate y'all watching. We'll see you next time.